So they
That
didn't
was
have
a
any capital
horrible
outlay
year.
there. Yeah.
Marriage falling apart.
And I love the fact that the school district is there.
Yep.
It's, like, well, I could have been, I was
Yeah, it is.
I bet you were. It
I
was
think
in
they'd had a hard
January.
time floating any bonds if they hadn't done that. People
And
wanted.
my dad,
Right, but
we used to go to the old settlers.
Oh yeah, sure. Still going on.
All
Yeah,
the time.
yeah. You ready? I've got it. Well, good morning. My name is Rick McNary. I grew up 7 miles east of here, about halfway between El Dorado and Roselia, and I have lived in Potwin for the last 40 years. And as you will see, my roots actually go back in my family to 1885 in Potwin. Today I've invited Cynthia Lemke, who's going to come up with me later and talk about the 3.5 bank robberies of Potwin. But when I went to my first history lesson in Bethel College, Dr. Keith Sprunger talked about historians being divided into two categories. He said there were parachutists and truffle hunters. And I love that idea because I'm more of a parachutist, but today we're going to do a little bit of both. We're going to kind of take that 30,000 foot view as we kind of settle down in, and then we'll do a little truffle hunting as we proceed a little bit further. But Dr. Sprunger also taught me a very valuable way to help remember things in history as far as dates. And when I was in high school and the history teacher tried to get us to remember dates, I could not do it. The only date I can remember from history is in 1814, we took a little trip. If there was a song associated with it that I could remember, and of course 1776, but I learned, he taught me to associate one thing with something else that was going on in the world. So we're going to look at a timeline too, because that to me is always really beneficial to understand the scope of history and the impact of what really has happened in just the last 250 years. So we'll start with maybe a map. And when you think about Kansas, now this is a map from 1858, and I don't know, can you turn these front lights off at all? Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. So when you think about the settlers moving west, and I brought my sister, Carmen. Many of you know from Jacob's Well, I brought her and her husband back to Kansas. So they're living here in Kansas in El Dorado. But as I was driving through the Appalachians, I thought, there was a period of time when people stood at the Appalachians and looked west and went, I wonder who owns all that land. Of course, the Native Americans were here. But when you think about the Europeans that had come over, that vast expanse of land really wasn't thing that they saw every day. So as people started moving west and as maps were created, the period of time when this area was really settled, this was actually called Oto. Butler was called Oto County. Now, if you look at maps from this area, the counties kind of moved around, kind of like peas on a plate trying to chase them with a butter knife. The counties were here, then they were over here, then this county was there. But at one time, this was Oto County, and Butler was right next to it. Marion was north, and then, of course, down here was the Native Americans. But I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview today. So we're going to talk about really kind of three different areas. One is in the township of Plum Grove, where Potwin is. And then, of course, El Dorado and Chelsea. Those were the first three that were really established in this area. But you think about, that's as far as the map went when some of the people came over to settle in this area. Now, this is the quick timeline. We're going to start in 1800, so we start with, of course, the Louisiana Purchase, and then Lewis and Clark. A few years later, traipsing back and forth across America, the War of 1812, the Missouri Compromise. Photography was established in 1826. when you think, I know that people who do study history go, boy, wouldn't it be great to have paintings from back in, or photographs from back in history. I put this in here because this has a tremendous impact on art. And later we're going to see a guy named Frederick Remington who came to live north of Potwin, a few miles. In fact, in 1882, he came out and started a sheep ranch, and that was before he became, of course, a famous artist. He started a sheep ranch out there with one of his buddies from Yale. But when photography came along, painters for a long time had tried to make their paintings look realistic, photorealism. Photography came along, and suddenly, in an instant, a camera could capture both time and light. Of course, it was only in black and white. So the art world started to kind of slowly react to that, and out of that came a movement called Impressionism. And Remington, several years later, was an impressionistic painter. And you see some of that movement in his stuff. I throw these things in here because they're really fascinating. So if you've ever seen the John Wayne movie, The Searchers, it's about this significant event in 1836 when Cynthia Ann Parker was kidnapped in Texas by the Comanches. And when she was kidnapped, she went and lived. She married one of the chiefs. She had a son named Quanah Parker. And over the period of time, people kept searching for her, and they finally found her and dragged her back to white civilization, and she didn't want to be a part of it anymore. She was, in her blood, she was Native American. I bring this up because Cynthia Ann Parker and her son Quanah, and he was the leader of the Comanches. And when you think about this area, you know, the Osage and some of the other Native American tribes that were here, you don't hear a lot about the Comanches. But there's a great book that recently came out about Quanah Parker and talked about the range of the Comanches, because they were such great horsemen, was 500 miles. And so people never really felt safe as long as they knew the Comanches might come. I bring that up because in a couple of the history books, it talks about in the late 1860s, that there was an Indian scare in this area. And it was actually Osage Indians the Osage tribe had told some of the white settlers, the Comanches are coming. So the white settlers were accustomed to the Native Americans around here, but the Comanches brought a certain amount of fear to them. And so there's actually a story where the people from Plum Grove and the people from El Dorado all went up to Chelsea. Apparently there was some kind of a fortification at Chelsea where they all felt safe. So when there was a real Indian scare, they all gathered together and went up to Chelsea. Mm-hmm. At the same time, Alexis de Tocqueville is touring all over America and writing about democracy in America. And I bring this up because it's so important to understand that the idea of the way land was held in aristocracy, that the top 3% of civilization owned all of the land. So land ownership was just not even a possibility. So the other 97% were really serfs that worked on the farms. You were a slave that worked on the farm. And the idea of land ownership propelled people to move west here in America. And so he's going around here writing about democracy in America. He also talked about the power of the township. I'm going to introduce you to the Plum Grove Township, but he thought the real roots and the real strength of democracy was actually in the township, because the township really decentralized power and put it in the hands of the local people that lived there. Now that's changed over the course of time, but initially he saw that as a very good thing. It's like, okay, the people who live and farm this land are the ones that make the decision about this land. And of course, the Preemption Act in 1841 said, okay, all of you moving west, you can probably get some land if you want it. At the same time, in 1845, the Irish potato famine happens. And when you think about land ownership, during the potato famine, in fact, my sons took me over there to Ireland a couple of years ago. First thing you see when you get off is a death ship that's in the Dublin harbor there. Because the Irish potato famine, because the aristocracy owned the land and the people who lived on the land had to build their own houses, they had to raise their own food, and really all they could grow was potatoes. Because anything else that they grew had value to it, and so the landowner would take it and sell it to England. And so when you think about the potato famine, the blight that just wiped out all of the potatoes in Ireland in the course of just a few months, and you think, well, then all of Ireland was starving because it just killed everything. No, it didn't. The exports of produce and meat during that period of time actually rose. So imagine being one of the farmers over there and your family's dying and you're working on a farm that's raising good crops and you're watching those wagons go by to England. So the potato famine. So I bring this up because Lord Scully, who is a pretty well-known person around this area as far as landowning, was an Irish aristocrat. And when he came over to America, he saw all this land and he started buying it up. Started in Illinois, got some in Missouri, got some in North Dakota, South Dakota, got some in Kansas, of course. And he started bringing this aristocracy, this kind of tenant farmer model back into it. I know farmers who farm on Scully leases, and if they want to build a house, they have to pay for it themselves. The Scully lease owns it. It's not their house. Here in Plum Grove. You think about all, and Lord Scully, in fact, he got shot, I think, a couple of times, or stabbed. I mean, the guy was just not well liked because he had this aristocracy idea about what land was. Along this same period of time, the Cherokee Trail starts, comes up because of the gold rush in 1849. So the Cherokee Trail, of course, you guys know, historians, it goes through El Dorado out here, but it also goes through my hometown. In fact, I sit on my land and I look out sometimes and think, that could have been 500 wagons go through here every day. And the Baker Fancher party, had like 1,000 head of cattle and 300 or 400 horses and going through there. Wow, that would have been cool to see. Of course, then at this same period of time, Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. He dies and has no idea that within the next century, it's going to transform politics in the world. And we'll get into that in just a minute. So then, of course, comes the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because the issue of slavery was becoming more and more prominent. And was Kansas going to be a free state, or was it going to embody slavery? A huge fight. And I think this is really fascinating for me to understand that Chelsea was established in 1871, and there's a guy named Joseph H. Adams who settles first in 1859. So back over here, and I've got Chelsea in the wrong spot there, don't I? Anyway, so when Joseph comes, he actually goes to Chelsea first, and then he comes down to northwest of Potwin. In fact, if you get a 96 and you go by Potwin, you cross the Diamond River Bridge just west of Potwin, and then immediately thereafter you cross the Whitewater River Bridge. Well, just south of there, where those two rivers come together, is where Joseph H. Adams first went. Later, his grandnephew, actually settled there, the Amos Adams family. So as this is getting established, Joseph H. Adams comes, he's the first one. The war ends in 1865. Kansas becomes a state in 61. The Civil War starts in 1861. There's a guy from Chelsea, and I can't ever get these right. Was it PGD Morton or PDG Morton? One of the two. PDG. They called him Peg Leg. Quite a character. But he was really influential in establishing this area and actually kept a wagon train coming back the Cherokee Trail full of supplies to the Southern sympathizers. He somehow had a deal in interrupting that. And that was actually just north of Potwin where that started to take place. So Plum Grove is established in 1871. El Dorado is about the same time. Quanah Parker's last battle. So this period of time, after Quanah Parker was born until 1875, there was a 40-year period in there where there were entire Army divisions with the one task of bringing Quanah Parker down. He was such a violent combatant, and they didn't think anything about going down into Mexico and stealing horses, and they were very ubiquitous. Interestingly enough, later in his life, before he passes away, he establishes a ranch, actually works for the American government. And if you go to Tulsa, you can go by where his really mansion was. Really a fascinating story called Empire of the Summer Moon. If you haven't read it, I'd encourage you to. So Quanah Parker's got this last battle. He turns into really being a great advocate for, instead of fighting them, joining them, or bringing them together. I bring this up because here's another book that came out within the last year. It's called The Summer of 1876. Wild Bill Hickok has the first shootout in 1865 in Springfield, Missouri. That's when the Wild West shootouts begin, or is legendary. So he's then killed in 1876. So this book talks about the summer of 1876. Hickok is killed in Deadwood. Wyatt Earp and Masterson are roaming the streets in Dodge City. Custer dies with his contingent at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. On the East Coast, pro baseball starts. At the same time, Jesse James has his last robbery in Northfield, Michigan. And then at that same time is also when the Prussian Mennonites came over and brought winter red wheat in the summer of 1876. As a historian, this kind of stuff really fascinates me. And then Potwin is established and Brainerd are established in 1885. They're established because of a railroad. And when they are established, Plum Grove just moves down to Brainerd and or Potwin. So let's jump over the 1900s. We'll go a little faster. The first flight at Kitty Hawk is in 1903. The Stapleton oil well is discovered in 1915. Of course, changes everything around here. That's also the time when Potwin really booms. Buildings are being built. In fact, you'll see a picture of the Potwin Christian Church in its original form here in a few minutes. And it's now a barn, but it was where King Park is, right along the main street as you go north and south in Potwin. And the people are like, it's too noisy with all the oil field trucks going by 7 days a week. We can't have service. We can't sing because there's too much racket. And so they buy a piece of land 2 blocks away and go build the Potwin Christian Church. So 1915 is really the golden era of Potwin. And of course, the Dust Bowl, the Depression, the late 20s. My dad was born in 21 and in Potwin. And so I heard the stories of the towels on the windows and the grasshoppers and all the stuff that came along with all this. So then in 1936 is where we're going to talk about the first bank robbery. And that was my grandfather, who actually worked at the Potwin Bank. My grandfather's name was Herbert William. They called him Bert, and he was the first guy robbed. You'll see a picture of him shortly. But you just think about all that goes on in this period of time. 41 through 45 is World War II. 50 to 53 is Korea. Vietnam goes on for 20 years. And in 1969, the first man on the moon. Then we got 1975, the second bank robbery, and you'll get the delight of meeting Cynthia Lemke here in a few minutes. In 1995 is the third bank robbery, and then in 1997 is the half bank robbery, which is a delightful story all by itself. So here again, so this is, if you go to Potwin, and the Joseph Road is the one that runs on the east and west parallel to the north of Potwin, you'll see this sign that says the Cherokee Trail crossed here. And this is the Cherokee Trail. And this is Plum Grove. This would be El Dorado, and Chelsea would be right about here. I want to talk about our township for a little bit because Potwin is in Plum Grove Township. That's where my family came in 1885. But again, this guy named Joseph H. Adams was the first guy to come, and his wife, Dinah, And they came here, I think in 1859. They first settled south of Potwin at that confluence of the Diamond Creek and the Whitewater. And incidentally, there's a brick foundation of a home out there. And I didn't even make that connection until I was doing all this research and realized when my kids were little, I used to go out there and cut firewood, and they were out traipsing around one day and they found this brick foundation. I mean, it's about 16 by 20. There was a fireplace in one end. It's about 4 feet tall, so they would have built up above that, and then there was a door going in. That would have been not built in 1859, I'm sure, but that's still part of that original Adams. So Joseph H. comes, and his first wife, Dinah, passes away, and she marries Margaret Pitzer, and they start having kids, and then they have a son named Joseph H. Adams, or Joseph and the first wife, Dinah, have a son named John Calhoun Adams, and he has, if you're ever around the Potwin area, you hear talk about the Adams Quarter north of the Arches. Well, he's the one that settled that. Now, interestingly enough, the Adams Quarter is also where the first city was actually in Plum Grove, and it was called Whitewater City. Not the town of Whitewater that we currently know, but as the trail came up and went through, in fact, if you're in Potwin and you go out to where some of you know Susan Hanselachek, she just lives out on the Adams Road, and you go north there, as far as you go north, and you swing around on 100th Street, that corner there is where it's assumed the Whitewater City, the first city in Plum Grove, actually was. Now, they built some cabins there, and then eventually, I'm sure a few floods, and they're like, this is not a really good idea to live this close to the river. But that's where the trail crossed. In fact, Denise Busenitz is a fantastic historian. And they own this land now, and she's actually gone out there with her family, and they've taken metal detectors, and they have found stuff that would be reminiscent of that period of time. They buried it back in the ground and have marked it on Google Maps. So Whitewater City was, thousands of people went through here. And this is actually where PDG Morton thwarted the attempted supplies going back to the south at this area. My gosh, wouldn't it be great to have a video of this period of time? Wow. So again, Joseph Adams starts here. He ends up here. They still own that land. If you guys know Skip Morgan, so there was a Doc Adams who was a veterinarian. That was one of the grandsons of Joseph H. And Doc Adams' family still owns that land. He had a stepson named Skip. He had 4 stepsons through Nadine: Hop, Skip, Nip, and Tuck. You probably knew them, didn't you? Yeah. Oh, yeah, incredible artist. Worked for Disney. Yeah, Skip is still alive. He's in Kalispell, and he's a great interest in putting this together. Says that Doc Adams was one of the greatest men he ever knew. Even though he wasn't his biological father, he was still his real dad. So all of this is happening over here in this part of Plum Grove. And so the actual city of Plum Grove was right over here. And they thought the railroad was going through there. Everybody thought, okay, the railroad's going to go through here. We're going to be in great shape. Well, there's another guy that comes up and convinces them to take the railroad through Potwin. And so all of Plum Grove was like, oh, great. Let's just move to Potwin or Brainerd. And so they do. So all of these inhabitants in Plum Grove just kind of like pick up and they move south. And so the railroad track goes along here. It goes through Potwin and it goes through Brainerd. Now, interestingly enough, when the railroad decided to build a bigger line over by the actual city of Whitewater, which came later, and they built the railroad over there, then people in Brainerd and Potwin were like, well, we'll just move to Whitewater. And it's really fascinating. Darrell Clausen's an incredible historian. He's got a wonderful museum in Whitewater if you've never been there. But he talks about the people in Brainerd, the businesses or banks or grocery stores or implement dealers, that they moved the entire city over to Whitewater, and they drive a big stake in the ground, and they had a block and tackle and teams of oxen, I assume, and they'd hook onto the building. They'd put the building on sleds, go wrap that cable around that stake out there about 300 yards that had the block and tackle on it, bring that cattle back this way and move the houses and the buildings that way. And the banks and the grocery stores stayed open the entire time. Can you imagine? Yeah,
Interesting.
a mobile grocery store in the late 1800s. And by the way, I have a YouTube video that has all of my presentations about the Joseph H. Adams family. And then this guy named William Joseph, in 1885, he works for a guy from Zanesville, Ohio, named Charles Potwin. Now, Charles Potwin was like a lot of the people back east. They saw land that they could buy, and so they started buying and working deals with the government, trying to buy up swaths of land. Potwin was one of those, Charles Potwin. And he had his agent in this area was a guy named William Joseph. And William Joseph convinced the railroad to go from El Dorado to Newton or to McPherson through Potwin. And it's interesting, and it just you historians a little cause of not conflict, just a little controversy maybe. So Joseph lays out what the city's going to look like. Interestingly enough, Sturgis is Charles Potwin's daughter. Her name was Sturgis. Violet was Potwin. It was his daughter. He's like, I'll give you some land. You got to name the town after me and name a few of the streets after my kids. So William Joseph, like, okay, sounds like a good deal. Now, you'll see here that the railroad goes this way, but there's this spur that goes up here. So right about there is where that sign that says the Cherokee Trail crossed there. And if you go, and I ran by that for years. I don't do that anymore, but I ran by that for years. And I'd see this swale, and I thought, what's that swale out here on the north part of Potwin? Well, come to find out, they stuck that sign in there, said the Cherokee Trail. Then I had some local historians go, it would have gone through all of this area, probably not that narrow of an area. Most likely that narrow area is where the railroad spur went because there was a rock quarry. I went to Bethel College, and all of that beautiful limestone of the administration building came from that rock quarry, as did many of the buildings in Newton. So that railroad spur would have come down here, they would have loaded the stuff onto the railroad, and then off they would have gone. So this guy is actually considered the founding father of Potwin. He was a restless guy. He actually ended up living in South Africa and was buried there. So I'm just going to show you a few of the Potwin. These are actually postcards that we've come across recently, and they've got some of the pictures. So there's the old depot. If you've gone to Potwin lately, the top part of this building was cut off. And at one time I had my photography studio right here, to give you a reference. And the $1 million question is, who is this lady and why is she hanging out in that window? Everybody that's ever seen this picture is like, what is she doing? What kind of place was this? So also, Potwin's had a lot of challenges. There's not any businesses really to speak of anymore. And so the old gas station, if you jump on Facebook and look for Station 85, there's 4 young couples that don't even live in Potwin, but they have a vision for transforming this into an incredible, beautiful complex that is really meant towards a younger generation. There will be a kind of a rural grocery store in there, and there'll be a meeting place, a venue, and also one of the guys, his father was John Baccia, and they brought the Baccia Italian sausage recipe from Italy. And they're going to try to mass produce this and make this a nationwide market, all done in this area. It's a fantastic vision that they have. And they put up the first beams to reconstruct it yesterday. And of course, the Whitmore building is still standing there. It's right across the street from the bank. It's for sale if you want to buy it. I know good things we can do with it. And that barn that's next to it is up on for sale. That's the community house that was built, again, 1915, 16, 17 was the era where a lot of buildings were being built. A lot of great commerce was going on in Potwin. I mentioned that church. that originally is in King Park, right across the street from the library. If you drive on River Valley Road north of Potwin, so River Valley's the road this side of Potwin, and you go north there, pop up over the hill and you drop down and you'll see two red barns. That's one of them. It's now owned by Jill and Dave Harder. This, of course, is now the Potwin Library. Potwin High School, which is, of course, is no longer there. My sister Carmen and our grandmother actually taught in this school. I love that picture. Wouldn't you like to hear them singing and banging those drums going down there? So this is where the grocery store used to be. It's now a vacant building, but there was a car garage there for several years. And of course, the Joseph well. So this is my family. They came from Missouri in 1885. So the railroad, in fact, Sonia sent me an article recently about the track being laid to Potwin on that date. So they came at the same time the track was being built. And I've always questioned, how did they, because they brought all the lumber to build a 2-story house from Missouri. And my question is, like, they bringing that over in oxen and cars or, wagons? No, apparently, where Hopkins Switch, where the microwave tower is there now, at one time there was a siding off of the railroad track there that they could put 25 different boxcars along there. That's where they loaded grain in and unloaded it. So that's 3 miles away from where my grandparents built their house. It's like, well, of course, they brought it over here and then schlepped it from there over to their house. So they built this house and they moved to town in 1915. That house was there until 1960, and some people named Slaymakers bought it and they tore that down. Now, for those of you who know anything about building, in those days they used balloon framing. So they weren't 8-foot studs, they were 16 or 18-foot long studs. So the outside wall was just all one wall, then they'd go put in the second floor. Well, my great aunt Ruby lost a porcelain head doll down one of those while the construction was going on. It was recovered in 1960 when they tore the house down. So this is the Potwin Methodist Church. And this has a huge stained glass window right down by where the pulpit is. It has my grandparents' name, G.L., George Leroy, and Mariah McNary. And I've told the church, if that window ever comes up missing, do not look in my house. So this is the 1936 bank robbery. So this is my grandfather, Bert McNary. And you can read that. I'll let you read that top part. In one of the articles, they quoted, and it was so neat for me to read the actual words that my grandfather spoke. I have no journal entries from him or anything that he ever left behind, but this journalist interviewed him. And as I'm reading this, like, my grandpa actually said that. I never knew my grandpa. He passed away before I was born. But the guy tried to lock him in the vault, and grandpa told the guy the vault was malfunctioning, and so he couldn't lock the thing. Well, grandpa sounded some kind of an alarm, which went out all over the city. But when grandpa talks about the guy coming in and waving the gun and wanting to rob him, and grandpa says, and without further ado, I handed him the money. If you ever hear me say without further ado, you know I'm carrying on the lineage of my grandfather. But I want you to notice something too. The front of the bank is an angle. So at some point in time, they decided later to square up that front of the Potwin Bank. And John would know probably more of the reasons why, but I was told it had to do something with bank robberies. Okay, at this time, I'm going to invite my good friend Cynthia Lemke to come up and talk about the rest of the bank robberies. Now, Mike and her husband, Mike, and Cynthia joined our church many years ago, and I became great friends with them. And Mike and I traveled to Nicaragua and places all over the world, standing right there. So I asked Cynthia to present, and she's like, nope, I'm not going to do it. I don't like to present. I said, well, how about you and I just stand in front and have a conversation? We practiced this once before at Frederick Remington. So we're going to have a conversation. So let's talk about the 1979 bank robbery. Now, these wonderful people that are in this picture, Carolyn Gaines, Lyda Wallace, and Helen Parker, and Shirley Atwood, and Clyde Waggy, and of course, Cynthia over there to the left. They worked at the bank for a long time. And they're still a part of the half robbery in some ways that you'll hear her talk about. So talk about how this day started and what happened, Cynthia.
Okay. It was January, cold, foggy. It was a Monday morning. The bank is always busy on Monday mornings. We had cars waiting outside for us to open our bank doors at 9 o'clock. So when we opened our doors, we immediately had customers. At that time, and you'll not find that in any other banks nowadays, we had 3 teller windows and 1 cash drawer. We all operated out of the same cash drawer, and we balanced at the end of every day. But when I had taken care of a customer at the middle window and walked away to answer the phone, I had to put the customer on hold so that I could go tell Carolyn, who was at the first window, that she had a phone call. And as I was approaching the middle window, a man stepped up to the window with a ski mask and a sack and a gun. And he says, put the money, all right, lady, put the money in the sack. And I looked at him and he had to repeat himself. Lady, put the money in the sack. So I'm thinking, okay, and I'm staring at the end of this gun, thinking that if I take my eyes off this, that gun's going to go off. But I step aside and I take the money out of the drawer and I give it to him. And he turns around and walks out. Immediately, the bank door is locked. We have a sales rep who had come into the bank and was sitting in the lobby waiting to talk to us about bank forms. And he got a description of the car and the license plate number. And that bank robber was caught within about an hour and a half. And he had pulled his car into the David's parking lot on Greenwich and Kellogg. Remember the old David's store? So that's where he was apprehended. So that's the story on the 1979 bank robbery.
So what did you think afterwards, after realizing you just stared down the barrel of a gun and bad things could have happened?
Well, it's a shock. It's just a real shock. But you process it the best way that you know how. Of course, we called the authorities. They come in, and the rest of the day was spent counting the cash, verifying how much was taken, and then just dealing with the bank authorities or with police officers. So.
And how much money was taken?
At that, $1,682. And that's what was in the cash drawer. So,
Wow.
yeah.
I've never asked you this question before, but I know one of your daughters is here. What'd you tell your children when you got home that night? Maybe I should ask you, Denise.
They'd already heard.
Oh.
I mean, word gets around fast. In fact, Denise just told me that she'd heard about it before I ever got home from work.
Wow.
So, got back to the school.
And that was before the days of social media.
That's right. That was, in fact, that was, at that time, the bank was a manually operated bank. We did everything with calculators and typewriters and Burroughs posting, lots of paper clips, lots of staples, and lots of files.
Hmm. Well, let's jump on to the next one.
Who was the robber? Was he just a guy passing through? How did that happen?
He was, I'm not sure how local he was. I think maybe he had actually done an attempted robbery in El Dorado the day before he came to Potwin. So he got sentenced and evidently kept screwing up while he was in prison because he had a long prison sentence. So.
And what were you telling me earlier about he got out?
Oh, yeah. He finally was paroled in 1995. Now, the robbery took place in 1979, and he was finally released on parole in 1995, which is the same time that the second bank robbery took place.
Well, let's move on to the second bank robbery.
Okay, second bank robbery. Let me go back to there. By that time, the bank had gone onto computer. It was now owned by the Michaelis family under the umbrella of Emprise Bank, but we were still a standalone bank. We still had 3 teller windows, but now all 3 tellers had a cash drawer with locks. And we had all had formal bank training, which really was beneficial. It was the day before the Labor Day weekend. And young man came into the bank lobby. And we all look to see who comes in to the bank doors. And he came to kind of the south end of the bank lobby, and he says, "Who owns the Ford Explorer out front?" And I said, "I do. It was brand new." I was so proud of it. And he says, "I want your keys." So, and then he shows a gun. So I said, I'll have to get my keys out of my purse in the back room. So I go and get it. In the meantime, we've got a customer, a young man, in the bank lobby, and he tells that customer to get on his knees right there, and he tells the girls across into the work area to get on their knees, kind of in front of the bank vault. And when I hand him my keys, he tells me to go join the girls, which I did. And then he gets the bank president, who was Jim Heffley at that time, from the north end of the bank, brings him in. Now he'd taken the money out of the cash drawers himself. But he tells Jim Heffley he wants the money out of the cash vault. And Jim was, of course, reluctant to say, "I can't get to the cash in the vault," because by that time it took two people to access the combinations of the vault, and Jim Heffley didn't have one. He didn't want to be one of those people. So Jim kind of argued with this young man, and I really felt like we were going to get shot. But finally, I don't know which one of us said, "Well, the cash vault's on a 15-minute time delay. So we can set that timer if you want to wait 15 minutes. And he didn't. So he finally turned and left, saying as he walked out the door, "Tell them Jesse James was here." But immediately our training just came into effect, and we locked the doors. Someone called the law. I got the bank, the robbery description forms out, gave one to each of our employees, and I said, go to separate areas of the bank, don't talk to anybody, fill out the description forms while it's still fresh in your mind. And we locked the teller doors, we locked the vault, we waited for the authorities, then we waited for the bank auditors to come and counted every drop of cash in that bank to determine what had been taken out of the drawers. So.
And how much did he make off with?
I don't know for sure, except I know that it was a whole lot less than the value of my vehicle. He should have just kept my vehicle and kept on going. But he took my vehicle and he took it about northwest part of Potwin by a small cemetery and parked the car there, threw my keys, and evidently had a car waiting for him. So the police would have been looking for my Ford Explorer. A customer was coming into Potwin and noticed my vehicle there at the cemetery and knew it was mine and thought that was really strange. He didn't know that the bank had been robbed until he got to town. And then he was a help to the authorities too. So.
And incidentally, where that land, where the car was dropped, is where the Joseph H. Adams family cemetery is. And I've been wanting to go up there and kind of clean things up. And so now she's tasked me with finding her car keys. She said, that's where he threw them out. That's where he left the car. Yeah, Morgan.
What were you instructed as an employee to do in the event of a robbery?
Well, there's different scenarios for bank robberies, but initially is lock that door, call your authorities, use your robbery description forms so that you can get a good description, accurate description of the bank robber.
Were you told to cooperate, do whatever he said?
Well, of course, absolutely. I mean, the most important thing is the safety of the employees, and get them in and get them out, so, yeah.
Now tell me, this felt different than the first one to you.
It did. For one thing, the robbery training that we had, because we had reviews of robbery trainings, because there's different scenarios, probably monthly. And so when this one happened, I was calmer, and I knew what to do. Whereas the first time, I really was struggling, to know the proper steps to take.
Did you feel like this one was more dangerous than the first one?
I don't know that I felt like it was more dangerous. No, I mean, if you've got a gun pointed at you, that's dangerous right there. Yeah. He has a question.
Do you
Yes.
recall the name of the authorities, like in the first or the second one?
Who?
Were they from El Dorado? Were they?
Yeah, it was Butler County and KBI that came out.
Who was it from Butler County?
I can't tell you that. It seems to me like I remember Kelly Herzig at one of those.
That would have been one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you had mentioned to me once before, one of these robbers, you thought to yourself, this is someone's grandchild.
Yes, and that's the 1995 bank robber, because it was this young man, and he when he came in, he had a ball cap, wraparound sunglasses, nice looking young man. And as it was coming down, I thought, this is every mother's nightmare, this son gone bad, so gone wrong.
Well, let's go back to this guy. It took a while to apprehend this one, correct?
It did. The authorities, one of the detectives said, he said, "Don't worry." He said, he'll only be able to keep it to himself for so long. He'll tell somebody. And that's exactly what happened. And that person gave him away, called the authorities. So.
And do you know, is he still imprisoned? Have you
No,
been?
he's been released. Yeah.
But then you, for both of them, were actually sent things from the parole board asking if you would testify, correct?
Well, I would get a letter from the parole board saying that they were up for parole, and did I have any input that would be considered during the parole hearing. And of course, I didn't have any idea. I hoped that he would be rehabilitated and paroled and, go on to make a life for himself. But I did stress that if they were paroled, that they not be allowed to come back to Butler County, and especially not to the Potwin Bank.
Well, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked earlier about what you told your children when you got home that day.
Well, they'd already known it. See, my husband was working on the south part of Wichita. He heard it on the news that the bank had been robbed. So I think he called me, and just to make sure I was okay. And I told him about the car, and he stopped at our house in Whitewater, and got the second set of keys. And so he came to the bank, but I'm sure that the girls had already known it by the time I got home from work. So.
Well, oh yeah, go ahead, Morgan.
Did you say how they caught this fellow? I didn't hear you.
Well, I think he confided in an in-law that he thought he could trust. But then I think his marriage went on the rocks. This young man's marriage went on the rock. And so I think they got back at him by calling the authorities and telling them about him admitting to the robbery.
Well, let's go to the half robbery. As you notice, the screen is blank because nobody wrote about it because it didn't happen, but it's a fantastic story.
Okay, that was in 1997, and I have to take my mind back there. It was kind of a slow day. Carolyn, my coworker, was at her desk, which was kind of at the south end of the main part of the bank area. And she noticed a man walk on the sidewalk by the bank, and she assumed he would come into the door or enter the bank. And he didn't. He walked on, and he turned, and she could see, well, she figured he went to the post office. And pretty soon, she saw him do it again. And she noticed that his car had been pulled alongside the bank instead of angled. Parking was alongside the bank. So she just kept her eyes on him, and he walked down the sidewalk, past the bank doors, turned the corner, and evidently walked clear around the building and got back in his car. So she got really curious then, and so she just went to the back room and kind of crouched down so she could watch him. And I think he did it the third time, got out of his car, walked down the sidewalk, turned the corner around the building, got back in his car. Fourth time, the fourth time when he came out of his car, he was wearing a witch's hat, a witch's wig. And now Carolyn had been relaying this information to the rest of us girls. So she said, he's walking down the sidewalk. So my desk at that time was by the bank door. So I got my bank key, and about the time he made it to the bank door, I locked the door. And I stood there, it's a glass door. I stood there at the corner of my desk with the phone, calling the authorities, described him while he was standing there, trying to get the door open. And he finally turned around and walked back to his car. So by that time, the authorities had been alerted, and I think there was a highway patrolman that heard the call, and he was the first on the scene officially. We had I don't know how he was connected to the Butler County office, but he lived in town, and he heard the call. He had just gotten out of the bathtub, so he threw his clothes on, and he came, and the guy was sitting in the car. And so when the authorities came, they did find weapons in the car. So they couldn't charge him with bank robbery because he hadn't even made it into the bank. But he had done something the day before at El Dorado. So he was charged on that. So, yeah.
And what did you tell the bank staff after the second robbery?
After the second robbery, I said, one more time and I'm out of here. So there was my incentive to lock him out of the bank.
How delightful. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Did you finally retire from the bank?
I did.
I'm curious, Jane Addams, I knew her, is that part of this
Yep.
Addams family?
Yep.
Was she the veteran's daughter?
Yep.
Veterinarian?
Yeah, and she lived in that one of the houses up
Sister.
there. Sister.
She was a sister to
Sister.
Doc
Yeah.
Adams.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, she played Mountain Dulcimer about the time
Oh,
I
okay.
got started, so that's kind of how I knew her.
Huh.
She was a music teacher at Remington, at least that first year
Oh,
of
okay.
Remington.
I didn't know that.
Mhm.
I didn't either. Huh. Yes, John.
Sometime early 1930s, the Leon Bank put an electric latch on their front door, and the door had quite a bit of glass there, and you didn't get in until you pushed the button doorbell, stepped over in front of the glass, was identified by somebody in the bank, and then they released it. And they were still using that in 1950. Maybe they are still today.
Interesting.
But I know that period of time, it was just automatic. If you were a bank, if you banked there, you just walked up and get the doorbell, and somebody pushes a button and releases it.
Huh. Interesting.
If you weren't recognized, you didn't get in.
Makes you wonder if maybe that bank had been robbed at some point.
Yeah.
The Marshall family owned that bank at that time, and maybe Oldest did, I don't know.
There's an interesting part of the story with my grandfather that they actually apprehended them up around the Emporia, And in the article, it says, after a high-speed chase. And I'm thinking, how fast can you go in 1936 down country roads? Yes, Morgan.
Rick, has there ever been a bank robbery in El Dorado?
That I do not know of. I know there were a couple in Whitewater.
I know Walnut Valley there was an attempted robbery at Walnut Valley, but I don't know.
Something to research.
The West Drive-In, and I was there that day.
Oh, wow.
And that it was the same kid that came out there to Potwin the next
Was.
day.
Really?
Yes.
It
Really?
was, yeah.
That's fascinating. If you can't hear, Teresa said she was at the West Bank, or the West
Right.
Drive-In for the bank, and it was attempted to be robbed the day before the guy went out to Potwin and robbed that one.
We were behind this huge big glass, and we all thought it was bulletproof. And this guy walked in with his gun and a knit cap over his face, and we just all stood there looking at it, and he tried to get the gun down. There was a little metal slots where you could slide your
Right.
gun. So he tried to get the gun down, and he finally gave up and just left. And we learned later that it was bullet resistant.
Would have been good information to have. Wow. Well, thank you all for coming today. And Cynthia, thank you for sharing your story.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I turned that off, yeah. And I turned it off. Oh!
So, thank you guys for coming. For those who don't know, my name is Bailey Martin Retliff. I'm the executive director here at the Kansas Oil Museum. I am so glad you could all join us. Next month, we do this on the third Thursday of every month. Next month, the title of the presentation is Somebody's Boy, presented by a longtime volunteer, Carol Turner. I believe in 1923, a young boy was found here in El Dorado, passed away, and no one could find his family. And so it's the story of how the community came together to provide for this child. So it's Somebody's Boy next month, third Thursday of the month. We look forward to seeing y'all again. Yes?
You know, I might suggest as a topic for one of your programs, in fact, a couple of years ago, there was somebody here from the Kansas Turnpike, and they were supposed to be talking about the history of the Turnpike. They didn't talk about, she didn't talk about that. I don't know if she got off on something else. And, I think there was miscommunication about the topic.
Okay.
But that, I think, would be an interesting
Yeah.
subject for you to present here.
Yeah, absolutely. We are still looking for a presenter for July if anybody wants to present. We do have presenters for the rest of the year, though, besides July. So that would be a great one to look for that month. So I will look into it. Thank you.
And the reason I'm saying this, I remember when the Turnpike was built in the late 50s. And at that time, you know, they sold bonds to finance the Turnpike. And they said that when those bonds were retired, the bond holders would be paid their money back.
Oh.
It's never happened.
That would be interesting to hear. So, well, thank you guys for coming. I hope y'all have a wonderful afternoon.
All right. Okay. All righty. Bye-bye. All right. Thanks for coming.